At the edge of history and myth, where memory fades into legend, the story of the Trojan War begins not with clashing swords but with desire, pride, and political tension simmering beneath the surface of the ancient Aegean world. Imagine a time when kingdoms were bound together not by treaties written on paper but by marriage alliances, sacred oaths, and honor that could not be broken without bloodshed. Long before the first Greek ships appeared on the horizon of Troy, the seeds of war had already been planted through rivalries among gods and men alike, reflecting the fragile balance of power that defined the late Bronze Age. For the ancient Greeks, this was not merely a tale of heroes but an explanation for why great civilizations rise, fall, and are remembered. Troy, a wealthy city positioned strategically near the Dardanelles, controlled vital trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea, making it not just a romantic destination in myth but a powerful economic rival in reality. Mycenaean Greece, fragmented into competing kingdoms like Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, and Ithaca, saw Troy as both a cultural equal and a political obstacle, and this underlying rivalry gave the legend its lasting force. According to tradition, the spark that ignited the war was intensely personal yet carried enormous political consequences. Paris, a Trojan prince raised away from court life, was drawn into a divine dispute that symbolized the destructive nature of choice and ambition. At the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, an event meant to unite gods and mortals in harmony, discord entered uninvited in the form of Eris, whose golden apple forced a judgment between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Paris's decision to favor Aphrodite in exchange for the love of Helen was not merely a romantic act but a catastrophic miscalculation that ignored the realities of power. Helen was not only the most beautiful woman in the world but also the Queen of Sparta, wife to Menelaus, and a crucial link in a network of alliances among Greek kings. Her abduction or elopement, depending on the version, was an insult that could not be ignored in a culture where honor defined legitimacy. For Menelaus, the loss was personal, but for his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, it became an opportunity to assert dominance over the Greek world by uniting rival kings under a single cause. The politics behind the war were shaped by an oath sworn years earlier, when Helen's suitors had agreed to defend her chosen husband against any future threat. This oath transformed a private grievance into a collective obligation, forcing kings who might otherwise have remained neutral to prepare for war. Agamemnon used this moment to solidify his leadership, calling upon warriors like Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Nestor, each driven by different motivations ranging from glory and loyalty to ambition and survival. The decision to launch an expedition against Troy was as much about internal Greek power struggles as it was about retrieving Helen. Control over Troy meant control over trade, prestige, and the narrative of strength that would echo through generations. The gathering of the fleet at Aulis, delayed by unfavorable winds and divine displeasure, already hinted that this war would demand unbearable sacrifices. The story of Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia to appease Artemis reflects how deeply politics, religion, and violence were intertwined, setting a grim tone before a single blow was struck against Troy. As the Greek fleet finally crossed the sea, Troy stood prepared not just as a city of lovers and poets but as a fortified stronghold with allies from across Anatolia. King Priam ruled over a city rich in culture, wealth, and military strength, defended by towering walls said to have been built by the gods themselves. Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, represented the disciplined defender, fighting not for conquest but for home and family. Unlike the Greeks, who sought glory and spoils, the Trojans faced an existential threat, and this distinction gave the conflict its emotional depth. When the Greeks landed on Trojan soil, the war did not unfold as a single continuous battle but as a grinding stalemate marked by raids, shifting alliances, and moments of brutal violence punctuated by long periods of waiting. This drawn-out nature of the conflict mirrors what historians believe about Bronze Age warfare, where sieges could last years and victory depended as much on endurance and resources as on battlefield heroics. Even in its earliest phase, the Trojan War revealed the immense human cost that would define it. Skirmishes claimed countless unnamed lives, villages were destroyed, and families on both sides endured loss long before the famous duels of legend. The gods, ever present in the narrative, symbolized natural forces, chance, and the unpredictability of war rather than literal divine intervention, reflecting how ancient people understood fate. What made this conflict so powerful in memory was not just who fought, but why they fought, driven by pride, obligation, love, and fear. As the war settled into its long and brutal rhythm, it became clear that no one involved would emerge unchanged. Heroes would rise, tempers would clash, and decisions made in moments of anger would alter the course of history. This was only the beginning of a struggle that would last 10 years, leaving behind ashes, songs, and questions that still echo thousands of years later. As the war moved beyond its opening year, the Trojan conflict hardened into a relentless test of endurance, strategy, and human will, transforming both armies into instruments of prolonged suffering rather than swift conquest. What many Greek kings had imagined as a short punitive expedition became a grinding campaign that consumed nearly a decade, revealing how fragile heroic ideals were when exposed to the reality of sustained warfare. The Greeks established a fortified beachhead along the Trojan plain, using their ships as both lifeline and potential escape, while Troy relied on its massive walls and the loyalty of its allies to withstand the siege. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow, and this deadlock defined the middle years of the war, where boredom, frustration, and pride became as dangerous as spears and swords. Raids on surrounding towns, ambushes in the plains, and sudden clashes between champions replaced large-scale battles, reflecting a form of warfare that was chaotic, personal, and deeply exhausting for those involved. At the heart of the Greek camp, tensions began to rise not only with the enemy but among allies themselves, exposing the fragile unity that Agamemnon had forced into existence. Achilles, the greatest warrior among the Greeks, embodied the contradiction of the war itself, possessing unmatched strength yet driven by a fierce sense of personal honor that often clashed with collective goals. When Agamemnon seized Briseis, a captive woman claimed by Achilles as a prize of war, the insult struck at the core of heroic identity, igniting a conflict that proved more devastating than any Trojan attack. Achilles' withdrawal from battle was not simply a personal protest but a turning point that shifted the balance of power, demonstrating how much the Greek cause depended on individual egos rather than disciplined command. Without Achilles, Greek assaults weakened, morale faltered, and the Trojans, led by Hector, began to press forward with renewed confidence. Hector's leadership during this phase of the war reveals the human cost of defense, as he fought not for conquest or glory but to protect a city filled with families, elders, and children who depended on his strength. His courage inspired the Trojan forces, allowing them to push the Greeks back toward their ships in moments of intense fighting that brought the war frighteningly close to Greek defeat. These battles were brutal and chaotic, marked by hand-to-hand combat where survival depended on skill, luck, and the will to kill before being killed. Ancient accounts describe rivers clogged with bodies, armor shattered, and warriors dragged from chariots into the dust, emphasizing that beneath the poetic language lay a vision of war as relentless slaughter. Losses mounted on both sides, with countless fighters dying anonymously, their names lost to history even as heroes claimed immortal fame. The emotional weight of the conflict deepened as the war dragged on, revealing the strain placed on leaders and soldiers alike. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, stepped into the vacuum left by Achilles' absence, wearing his armor to inspire the Greeks and drive back the Trojans. His temporary success exposed both the desperation of the Greek forces and the dangerous illusion that any single victory could end the war. When Hector killed Patroclus, the moment shattered what remained of restraint, transforming the conflict into a cycle of revenge that erased the boundary between duty and rage. Achilles' return to battle was swift and catastrophic, unleashing violence on a scale that redefined the war's intensity and confirmed how deeply personal loss could alter the course of history. As Achilles cut through Trojan ranks, the battlefield became a place of terror rather than honor, and the idea of heroic warfare collapsed under the weight of unrestrained fury. His duel with Hector, fought beneath the walls of Troy, stands as one of the most powerful images in war literature because it captures the moment when destiny, politics, and human emotion collide. Hector's death was not only a tactical disaster for Troy but a psychological blow that shook the city's belief in survival. With their greatest defender gone, the Trojans retreated behind their walls, while the Greeks, though victorious in battle, gained no immediate resolution. The war continued, proving that even the fall of a hero could not end a conflict fueled by pride and obligation. By this stage, the Trojan War had consumed immense resources and lives, leaving both sides trapped by the very commitments that had drawn them into battle. The Greeks could not return home without victory, as failure would undermine Agamemnon's authority and stain their honor, while the Trojans could not surrender without losing their city, their identity, and their future. The dead lay scattered across the plains, alliances were strained, and the gods themselves seemed divided, reflecting the chaos of a war that no longer had a clear moral center. What began as a dispute over a single woman had evolved into a struggle that devoured generations, proving that wars rarely remain bound to their original causes. As the middle years faded into a weary stalemate, both Greeks and Trojans stood at the edge of exhaustion, unaware that the most decisive and deceptive act of the war was still to come. As the war entered its later years, exhaustion settled over the plains of Troy like a permanent fog, dulling the initial passion that had once driven both armies forward. Veterans on both sides carried scars not only on their bodies but in their minds, shaped by years of constant violence, loss, and uncertainty. The Greek camp had become a place of routine survival rather than heroic ambition, while inside Troy, fear and resilience existed side by side as families learned to live under the shadow of siege. By this stage, the conflict was no longer sustained by hope of quick victory but by the inability of either side to step back without losing everything. Every fallen warrior increased the pressure to continue, creating a cycle where sacrifice justified further bloodshed. This psychological trap is what transformed the Trojan War from a prolonged battle into a defining catastrophe for an entire generation. With Hector dead and Troy's greatest champion gone, leadership within the city shifted toward survival rather than aggressive defense. King Priam, once confident in the strength of his sons and allies, now relied on diplomacy, prayer, and the endurance of his people. New Trojan defenders stepped forward, including foreign allies drawn by loyalty or obligation, but none could fully replace Hector's presence. For the Greeks, Achilles' unstoppable violence brought battlefield dominance but also revealed the limits of brute force. Troy's walls still stood, unbroken and defiant, and no amount of slaughter outside the gates could deliver the decisive victory Agamemnon needed. The Greeks faced a strategic dead end, forcing them to confront the reality that heroism alone could not end the war. This realization marked a critical turning point, shifting the nature of the conflict from open combat toward deception, strategy, and psychological warfare. The deaths of key figures continued to reshape the battlefield in ways that deepened the sense of inevitability surrounding Troy's fate. Achilles himself, despite his near-divine reputation, was not immune to loss, and ancient tradition holds that he fell to an arrow guided to his heel, the single vulnerable point that defined his mortality. His death sent shockwaves through the Greek forces, proving that even the greatest warrior could be claimed by war. The fall of Achilles symbolized the collapse of the heroic age itself, as the warriors who had defined the conflict were gradually erased. Ajax, another towering Greek champion, succumbed not to enemy blades but to despair and madness after losing honor in a dispute over Achilles' armor, highlighting how psychological trauma was as deadly as physical wounds. These losses left the Greeks shaken but also desperate, pushing them toward extreme measures to justify the years of sacrifice already made. Inside Troy, the emotional toll became unbearable as funerals replaced festivals and hope thinned with each passing season. Andromache, Hector's widow, embodied the suffering of those left behind, representing countless women who endured loss without the promise of glory. The city's population dwindled as food supplies tightened, allies wavered, and constant vigilance drained the spirit of its defenders. Priam's visit to Achilles' tent to reclaim Hector's body stands as one of the most human moments in the story, showing how shared grief could momentarily bridge the divide between enemies. Yet such moments of compassion did nothing to halt the momentum of destruction, as both sides remained bound to their obligations and fears. War had become a force of its own, consuming reason and leaving only survival as a guiding instinct. The Greek leadership increasingly turned toward cunning rather than strength, with figures like Odysseus advocating for intelligence and patience over direct assault. This shift reflected a broader truth about warfare, where prolonged conflict favors adaptability rather than raw power. The Greeks conducted raids, spread misinformation, and tested Troy's defenses, probing for weaknesses not in stone but in human trust. The Trojans, exhausted and desperate for an end, struggled to distinguish genuine threats from false retreats, a vulnerability born from years of unrelenting pressure. Each minor success or failure carried enormous emotional weight, amplifying fear and hope beyond their actual strategic value. By this stage, the war had distorted perception itself, making rational decision-making increasingly difficult for leaders on both sides. Casualties continued to rise, though ancient sources rarely provide exact numbers, instead emphasizing the scale of devastation through imagery of blood-soaked plains and grieving households. Modern historians estimate that such a prolonged Bronze Age conflict would have resulted in tens of thousands of deaths when accounting for soldiers, civilians, and those who succumbed to famine and disease. Entire communities around Troy were erased through raids, while Greek homelands suffered from the absence of their kings and warriors, leaving political instability in their wake. The war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping trade networks, power structures, and cultural memory across the Aegean world. What had begun as a clash driven by honor and desire now stood revealed as a force capable of dismantling entire civilizations. As the final phase of the war approached, both Greeks and Trojans sensed that the end, whatever its form, would be irreversible. The Greeks stood on the brink of abandoning the ideals that had defined them, while the Trojans clung to the belief that endurance alone might yet save them. Neither side fully understood that the conclusion would come not through open battle but through deception that exploited fatigue, hope, and trust. The stage was set for a decision that would define the war's legacy for all time, proving that the most decisive moments in history are often born not from strength, but from the careful manipulation of human weakness. As the war reached its decisive stage, the battlefield shifted from open plains to the fragile space between hope and deception, where exhaustion made even the strongest walls vulnerable. After years of failed assaults and unbearable losses, the Greek commanders faced the reality that Troy could not be taken by force alone. Their army was worn down, their heroes mostly dead, and their purpose questioned by men who had sacrificed their youth for a war that seemed endless. It was in this moment of desperation that cunning replaced courage as the primary weapon, and the idea of victory through deception began to take shape. The Greeks crafted a plan that reflected a deep understanding of human psychology, recognizing that after 10 years of siege, the Trojans were as desperate for peace as the Greeks were for triumph. The construction of the massive wooden horse symbolized this shift in warfare, representing not brute strength but calculated illusion. Presented as an offering to Athena, the horse was meant to signal Greek surrender and appease divine anger, exploiting the Trojans' religious beliefs and longing for an end to suffering. When the Greek fleet appeared to withdraw, leaving the horse behind, it created confusion within Troy that was far more dangerous than any direct attack. Years of fear suddenly gave way to cautious optimism, a psychological turning point that revealed how war fatigue can cloud judgment. Despite warnings from figures like Laocoon and Cassandra, whose skepticism reflected lingering awareness of Greek deception, the dominant desire for closure overwhelmed reason. The Trojans' decision to bring the horse inside their walls was not an act of foolishness but a human response to prolonged trauma, illustrating how even disciplined societies can collapse under emotional strain. As night fell and celebrations filled the city, Troy experienced a brief illusion of victory, a final moment of peace that made the coming destruction all the more devastating. Hidden within the horse were elite Greek warriors, chosen not for raw strength but for loyalty and precision, men who understood that their success depended on silence and timing. When darkness settled and the city slept, the Greeks emerged, opening the gates for the returning army that had concealed itself nearby. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a massacre defined by confusion, betrayal, and terror. Troy's defenders were unprepared, scattered, and unable to organize resistance, proving that the most catastrophic defeats often occur when vigilance is abandoned. The sack of Troy was swift and merciless, erasing the boundary between soldier and civilian as violence spread through streets and homes. Ancient sources describe flames consuming temples, cries echoing through alleys, and families torn apart in moments that stripped war of any remaining honor. King Priam was killed at his own altar, a symbol of how completely the city's spiritual and political foundations were destroyed. Women and children were enslaved or killed, reflecting the brutal norms of ancient warfare, where conquest meant total domination rather than negotiated peace. While the Greeks achieved the victory they sought, the manner of their triumph revealed a moral collapse that mirrored Troy's physical destruction. The human cost of the war reached its peak during this final act, as years of accumulated suffering erupted in a single night of irreversible loss. Estimates suggest that Troy's population was largely wiped out or displaced, while Greek casualties, though less visible in victory, were staggering after a decade of constant warfare. Entire bloodlines ended, cultures fragmented, and memories were reduced to ashes and exile. Aeneas' escape, carrying his father and leading survivors away from the ruins, symbolizes how the legacy of Troy did not end in destruction but transformed through displacement and endurance. For the Greeks, the victory brought no lasting peace, as many leaders would face tragic returns home, haunted by guilt, divine punishment, and political chaos. The fall of Troy marked more than the end of a city. It signaled the collapse of an era shaped by heroic ideals that could not survive the realities of prolonged war. The conflict exposed the limits of honor, the danger of pride, and the destructive power of obligation when it overrides compassion. What began as a dispute rooted in desire and divine rivalry concluded with the annihilation of a civilization, proving that wars often evolve far beyond their original causes. The Trojan War endured in memory not because it celebrated victory, but because it captured the full spectrum of human behavior under extreme pressure, from bravery and loyalty to cruelty and despair. As the smoke cleared and survivors fled into an uncertain future, the legacy of the Trojan War was already taking shape in stories, songs, and reflections meant to make sense of the unimaginable. The Greeks returned home as victors, yet many carried the weight of what they had done, while the Trojans lived on through exile, shaping new histories far from their fallen city. This final phase of the war revealed the ultimate truth behind its legend, that the greatest destruction was not measured in broken walls or lost lives, but in the irreversible transformation of everyone who took part. The stage was now set for reflection, memory, and the enduring lessons that would define how this war was remembered for thousands of years to come. In the aftermath of Troy's destruction, the true consequences of the war unfolded not on the battlefield but in the long, painful journeys that followed, revealing that victory and defeat were equally heavy burdens to bear. For the Greeks, the fall of Troy did not bring the peace or glory they had imagined when they first set sail. Instead, it marked the beginning of fractured homecomings filled with betrayal, loss, and divine retribution, as later myths and traditions would emphasize. Leaders who had survived 10 years of war returned to kingdoms that had changed in their absence, where power vacuums, resentment, and fear had taken root. Agamemnon was murdered upon his return, a grim reminder that authority gained through war could not guarantee safety at home. Odysseus wandered for years before reaching Ithaca, facing storms, monsters, and temptations that symbolized the psychological scars carried by veterans long after combat ends. These stories reflect a deeper truth about warfare, that its damage extends far beyond the moment of victory, reshaping lives and societies in ways that cannot be undone. For the survivors of Troy, exile became the defining legacy of the conflict, turning loss into a journey rather than an ending. Figures like Aeneas represented the resilience of those who endured total defeat, carrying memories of a destroyed homeland while seeking a future elsewhere. His journey, later immortalized by Roman writers, illustrates how the Trojan War influenced not only Greek identity but also the cultural imagination of civilizations that followed. Through these narratives, Troy was never truly erased. Instead, it lived on as a symbol of endurance, tragedy, and rebirth through memory. The displacement of Trojan survivors mirrors real patterns seen throughout history, where war scatters populations and forces cultures to adapt or disappear. In this way, the Trojan War functions as both myth and historical reflection, capturing the universal experience of loss caused by prolonged conflict. When viewed through a historical lens, the Trojan War likely reflects a series of late Bronze Age struggles rather than a single, unified event, shaped over centuries into a powerful narrative. Archaeological evidence from Hisarlik, the site commonly associated with Troy, suggests multiple layers of destruction and rebuilding, indicating repeated conflicts that could have inspired the legend. These findings support the idea that while the story is wrapped in mythology, it is grounded in real tensions over trade, power, and territory between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian cities. The blending of fact and fiction allowed ancient storytellers to preserve historical memory while amplifying its emotional impact, ensuring that the lessons of the past would resonate with future generations. This fusion is why the Trojan War remains compelling, not as a simple tale of heroes and gods, but as a complex reflection on the nature of war itself. The war's cultural impact cannot be overstated, as it shaped how ancient societies understood honor, fate, and human limitation. Through characters like Achilles, Hector, Helen, and Odysseus, the story explores conflicting values, showing how pride can inspire greatness while also inviting destruction. Achilles' rage demonstrates the cost of unchecked emotion, Hector's defense highlights duty and sacrifice, and Helen's role exposes how individuals can become symbols around which massive conflicts are built. These characters endure because they feel human, flawed, and driven by motives that remain recognizable today. The Trojan War's enduring power lies in its refusal to offer simple moral conclusions, instead presenting war as a force that amplifies both the best and worst aspects of humanity. In terms of human cost, the Trojan War stands as a reminder that prolonged conflict consumes entire generations, leaving few untouched by its violence. Ancient sources emphasize not numbers but suffering, portraying battlefields littered with bodies and cities reduced to silence. Modern interpretations suggest that such a war would have devastated regional populations, disrupted trade networks, and weakened political structures across the Aegean world. These consequences mirror patterns seen in later historical conflicts, reinforcing the idea that the Trojan War is not only a story of the past but a lens through which all wars can be examined. Its relevance endures because it confronts audiences with uncomfortable truths about ambition, revenge, and the price of pride. Ultimately, the Trojan War survives because it captures the full arc of human conflict, from its beginnings in desire and rivalry to its end in ruin and reflection. It shows how small decisions can escalate into catastrophic events and how once war begins, it develops a momentum of its own, dragging individuals and nations toward outcomes they can no longer control. The story warns that no side truly wins, as even the victors return home diminished, carrying memories that shape their futures. Through poetry, drama, and later retellings, this war became a shared memory that helped ancient societies understand their world and their place within it. As you reflect on the Trojan War, it becomes clear why this ancient conflict continues to fascinate audiences thousands of years later. It is not just a tale of gods and heroes, but a timeless exploration of power, politics, love, and loss, told through the lens of one of history's most enduring legends. If you feel that our videos are helping you gain accurate, engaging, and meaningful knowledge about the great wars of history, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell notification button so you never miss our latest war history series, where we continue to bring the past to life with depth, realism, and powerful storytelling.